Warm welcome to all who are sharing in this webinar, friends both here in the UK and in the USA, and indeed welcome to you all wherever you are in the world at this point in time. My name is Adrian and I have the privilege of chairing the Progressive Christianity Network in Britain. Following the very sad death of Marcus Borg, PCN Britain decided that they would hold for 5 years an annual conference in Marcus's honour. Marcus, who did so much for the progressive movements across the world. So this is the final such conference, but of course it's the first we've held online. It had been hoped before the pandemic that this particular conference would be held in the church in Cars Lane in Birmingham, well used to hosting radical lectures and conferences. And Deshna was indeed all geared up to cross the Atlantic. There was also the possibility that Bishop Jeremy would be in the UK at the same time. And so we dreamed of a conference where leading younger voices across the continents would share their thoughts and indeed their vision on the future of progressive Christianity in our different cultures. That in-person gathering, of course, was not to happen. And we might reflect, I suppose, on the air miles that we've saved, especially at the moment as we in the UK are about to host COP26. And that discussion perhaps is for another day. But I'm delighted that Deshna and Jeremy now join us online, and I'm particularly grateful Jeremy has risen from his bed at 5 o'clock in the morning in Brisbane to give his talk live. Just over a month ago, we received the sad news of the death of Bishop Jack Spong, another leading light for progressive Christians, and who, like Marcus, travelled extensively and attracted hundreds of people to each of his lectures. And so this evening, we remember with huge gratitude both Marcus and Jack, personal friends to so many of us. After the first talk by Deshna, there will be a 5-minute break. You can go and renew your coffee, do whatever you have to do. But during those 5 minutes, we're going to have on screen pictures of Jack and Marcus with some audio clips from talks that they have given. It'll be a time to give thanks as we remember them, and maybe a personal time of reflection for you in the middle of this evening's webinar. Joining me tonight is Julie, who you can now see on screen, Julie Grove from the church at Cars Lane. And it will be Julie in a moment who will introduce Deshna Shine. Later, my fellow trustee, Sue Hobley, who I hope will appear on screen any moment now. Sue will introduce Jeremy. Our facilitator tonight is Sarah Guilfoyle. There's Sue. And there's Sarah, who is our facilitator and our administrator at PCN. And she, alongside Simon Cross, who is our vice chair, there's Simon, they will oversee the question and answer session, which follows the second talk. That's all I want to say for the moment. It's lovely to welcome you wherever you are. And I'm going to pass over now to Julie, and thank you all for being with us.
Thank you, Adrian. It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Deshna Shine. Deshna is an ordained interfaith minister and chaplain, a healing ritual facilitator, a yoga instructor, a published author, international speaker, and a visionary. A religious studies graduate and ordained in 2019, she's lead author, project director, and editor on the progressivechristianity.org's children's curriculum, called A Joyful Path. She grew up in a thriving progressive Christian church, the pastor's kid, and in her words, was blessed to be involved in a community that was open, educated, innovative, and inclusive. For 14 years, until last year, she was executive director of progressivechristianity.org and Progressing Spirit. Deshna is passionate about sacred community, nourishing children spiritually, and transforming Christianity through a radically inclusive lens. Deshna, we are delighted to welcome you remotely to the UK, and we look forward very much to sharing in your wisdom. So, progressive Christianity, hope for the future? Over to you, Deshna.
Hello, my friends across oceans and lands. Many of you I've had the pleasure of meeting in person, and some of you I'm meeting for the first time on these Zoom calls that we've had. It's a great honor to be here today, and I'm very thankful that you are interested to hear a little bit about what I have to say and my experience. Also, if Julie, you could introduce me at all of my speaking engagements in that gorgeous British accent, I would be really, really delighted. So thank you. And also my daughter, who just loves British accents, would be really excited about that as well. Welcome to all of those watching. I know that we have viewers here in the United States, in Australia and England, and maybe elsewhere. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I want to first acknowledge that I'm sitting here on the traditional village sites of the Chinook, the Cayuse, Yakamis, Klickitats, Nez Perce, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Yakima, among many other tribes who have made their homes along the Columbia River. These tribes have been stewards of this land since time immemorial, and I extend my thanks for their hospitality. Now, I know that we're here to memorialize the great leaders of the progressive Christian movement, specifically the wonderful, incredible Marcus Borg, as well as Bishop John Shelby Spong. And for me, these change makers were both giants, theological giants, and heroes, and I'm assuming for many others as well. They made Jesus accessible to me, the Bible accessible to me, and a relationship with God, the greatest mystery of all, a possibility. I'm deeply grateful to them for their work and their bravery. And also, you invited me here to talk about the hope for the future. And so there are many, many young, diverse change makers and leaders and theologians and pastors and authors who are today doing the work. And I would like to lift up them as we now chart the course for the future. So I would like to begin with a short story. A young girl falls in love with the passion and message of a TV evangelist. So she asks her parents to take her to church. She also knows at this young age of 8 years old that she too wants to be a pastor. She feels it in her bones, and it's a calling that will stick with her her entire life. Her stepfather, raised in Seventh-day Adventism, only knows his own experience, and so he takes her to their local Adventist church. She gets dropped off because she's the only one in her family who actually wants to go to church. She becomes enveloped in the church community. There she finds meaningful work. She finds opportunity for learning and leadership. She has a group of loving and kind fellow youth that she gets to be a part of. She travels all over the world on mission trips, mostly building schools and churches and renovating hospitals. She is confident in the ministry and the belief system she is immersed in. But deep within her, she also knows that she is different. She knows she isn't a normal girl. She likes girls, not boys, and she always has, but she keeps that to herself because she knows that isn't acceptable. She is something like a tomboy, but that isn't quite right either. Her parents tell her that she's too sensitive, too needy, even as a baby. And her church tells her that those desires and feelings she holds within her are wrong and may even get her a one-way ticket to hell. So she pushes them down and she denies her longing and who she really is. She goes on to lead churches and communities for 20 years of her young adult life. She marries a man because that's what you do. And she doesn't question her beliefs that she is taught. She, along with everyone else, is not allowed to question. She must show a solid faith. She's successful in her career, but she's not fully herself. Until one day, her authenticity cannot stay hidden anymore. It is pushing at the tight lid, threatening to emerge of its own accord. Her essence is brimming over and her questions are getting too big. She has an affair with a woman. She leaves the church and the only community she has ever really known in the midst of a full-on explosion of her life. She gets a divorce and she begins to question her faith and her beliefs. Her parents are hurt and disappointed. Her friends love her, but they don't understand. No one is surprised that she is with a woman, but everyone hopes that it wouldn't be true. She can no longer push down her true self. She is a seeker, a questioner, a musician, a gay woman, and in her truest hearts, a pastor. She is left without community, without a solid belief system, and with a lot of guilt, shame, and confusion. Okay, so here she is. Fast forward, well, let's see. She leaves Seventh-day Adventism and she begins her search for a spiritual path and a community where she can be her fully authentic self. Eventually, she comes across progressive Christianity, but she still has a lot of questions and doubts. I want to make sure. Just give me a wave if something's not working right, you guys. Fast forward 4 years and she has found her soulmate and she is married. She is candidating for a pastoral position in the United Church of Christ in a local church. She is voted unanimously by both the search committee and the board. But the big day is when she will stand in front of the large church in person and online attendees, and she will tell them who she is. And not some watered down, careful version, but the truest version of herself, because she is at a point in her life when she can only be her authentic self, and she will take nothing less than full acceptance of that. She tells them who she is, and she makes the congregation laugh and cry, and she calls them to live into their beliefs. She calls them to remember themselves as the beloved community, perfect and whole, even as they are broken and growing like her. She and her wife are asked to step out of the church while they vote. They wait in an office down the hall, holding each other in quiet. After some time, they are asked back into the church. She has been voted unanimously, yes. Not a single no out of the hundreds. When her wife and her return to the chapel, hundreds of people wave colorful banners and cheer. She is received. She is welcomed radically with her gayness, her questions, her doubts, and her vision of a beloved community. She is seen for who she is, and she is radically included and celebrated. Inside of her is a young girl who is finally fully seen and loved. This is the heart of progressive Christianity. And in case it wasn't obvious, that story is about my wife, and I'm in awe of her. So it was a very moving experience to be welcomed into the church in this way. Well, here's another story. Growing up in a progressive Christian church, I took for granted the sacred community that I had access to and was immersed in. But looking back, I can see how it shaped me in so many ways. When I was bullied for 6 months during my 6th grade year and completely excluded for no reason other than the jealousy of my former best friends, I could still walk into church each week and be welcomed with open hearts and open arms. I was celebrated, invited to speak, invited to lead, and loved just as I was. Because of this and my experience in a church yearning to be radically inclusive, I learned at a very young age to make room at the table for all people, even those very different from me, even those hurting and angry and messy and loud and all the things, and different, of course. It became woven into the tapestry of who I am. If someone needs clothes, I will offer them. If someone needs a place to stay, we make room for them. If someone needs to be witnessed in their pain or grief, I'm able to do that for them. Deeply ingrained in me is the ability to forgive and to see the divine in all beings. This is the heart of progressive Christianity. And it gives me so much hope to know that progressive Christianity is shaping lives, the theology and perspectives of so many young people around the world. I remember my father, the pastor of our church, getting phone calls many a night, and him gathering a button-down shirt, a tie, and some cash, and meeting someone at a motel with a meal and a room for the night. I remember being told by my parents, well, we're not sure what is true, but we believe it's something like this. But what do you think? What do I think? I get to look within myself for my own wisdom. I was lifted up to find my own path and my own beliefs, while at the same time I was fully grounded in a loving, inclusive community. When Steve showed up at church as Mary, we held hands with her, cried with her, smiled at her, and welcomed her to be with us as she is. Now, it wasn't perfect. It was often messy, and we were learning as we were going, but we were learning, we were open, and we were growing. Bishop Yvette Flunder, the senior pastor at the City of Refuge in Oakland, California, told me, quote, "I don't think church was ever supposed to be theater style and choreographed down to a fine science. I don't think that was ever the intent or the heart of God. I think it was supposed to be less ceremonial and more familial." She says, "The success of church should not be determined by the number of people in the seats on Sunday. That is one of the things we do. We ask ourselves at the end of the week, how many people did we serve? That's a different number. I see that as church unusual." And then when I asked her, how do you imagine the future of church? Her answer was, a familial, sacred community, secure, inclusive, welcoming, raggedy. In that raggedy environment, we don't need choreography because our people show up with all their realness and their unique needs and authentic selves. She says church should be full of real moments, like your mama's house. In your mama's house, she says, if mama knows that one of your children is real different, then your mama is going to make provisions for that child, and she will start with the child who needs the most support. Bishop Flunder was consecrated as the bishop of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, which began in 1999 and now has some 60 member churches and about 40 affiliates. Although most of the congregations are predominantly African American and led by LGBTQ people or LGBTQ affirming clergy, the fellowship also includes whites and Hispanics. Its churches are also in Asia, Africa, and Australia. And her church in the City of Refuge Church in Oakland, California is just full and vibrant and noisy. Progressive Christianity is a diverse multi-layered, complex being with many different theologies under its large umbrella. But here is the common ground that I have found working with in the field with people and communities all over the world. In progressive Christianity, it is okay, encouraged even, to question one's beliefs. That's the bottom line. Everything else is up for exploration, up for discussion. If we have the space to support and the support to question what we have been taught, what we are saying essentially is that you can find your authentic self and we will walk alongside you in that journey and celebrate you. So, is progressive Christianity a hope for the future? I think it's very possible, but I also think we're going to need to level up. All that preaching from the pulpits about radical inclusion and justice, it's time to take that to the polling places, to the grocery store, to your neighborhood and your family dinner table. It's time to examine how we have contributed to unjust systems because of our personal comfort. It's time to acknowledge how these unjust systems have kept us from the community Jesus embodied. And how do we level up? First, we must listen to our grief, individually and collectively. Those of us in white privilege, we are losing something after all. Our privilege, our perceived superiority, and our comfortable and familiar ability to other, we're losing that, as we should be. We must accept that our anger is telling us that something is not right. We can no longer hide under the blankets of denial, guilt, fragility, shock, and numbness. We must look at that grief with eyes wide open and ask, how is it informing our spending, our sense of ownership, our actions, and our empathy today? For me, the first step has to start with reparations. Can the church, can Christianity, can progressive Christian churches make reparations? I believe so. And of course, this is different all around the world. There are different reasons for reparations. There are different ways. On this slide, you see the homepage of a website of Middle Church in New York City. This is led by the Reverend Jackie Lewis. She is a Black woman, and she has a thriving, diverse, multi-generational congregation. And on their homepage, front and center, they are clearly addressing reparations. And then below that, you will find a clear statement of their progressive theology. Christianity is among the most bloody religions in the world, and certainly it has been a conquering religion. Over and over again, it has conquered and oppressed. Christianity can make reparations, but beginning is the hardest part. We have to begin with repentance and truth-telling. Repentance is very hard. Repentance is both an acknowledgement and a commitment to turning away. So reparations must begin with seeing oneself as the manifestation of the divine on earth. We have to believe that about ourselves before we can believe it about others. How can we see ourselves as the handiwork of God? Authentic self-affirmation is a very hard thing to do. How can we fully embrace our own divinity? Well, we must humanize Jesus so that we can understand the divinity in ourselves. And when we have a true love for ourselves, it is out of that place that we can truly love other people. And then repentance is actually a lot easier. Then every church, every network, every organization, every pastor, every leader must publicly and clearly repent and ask forgiveness. I believe there is no other way to begin this growth that progressive Christianity is at the forefront of. Put it on your website, preach it from the pulpits, put it in your newsletters, send it to the newspapers. Acknowledge the harm that has been caused in the name of Jesus and for the church, and commit to doing better. We must act. Empire living, which embodies the sins of human nature, has been crushing us all. We cannot pretend that just because we are kind, liberal Christians that we don't have to act, or that we weren't a part of it, or that we aren't a part of it. Black, brown, and trans bodies are dying for our sins over and over again. We can no longer turn a blind eye. We must create a bigger table with every voice in mind and make sure that everyone is there when we start to wrestle with solutions, because we belong to each other, as Indigenous teachers have said. In sharing his vision of the future of progressive Christianity, Marcus Borg said, quote, "To comfort and to challenge is the twofold purpose of Christianity. Deep trust in God provides comfort in times of trouble and tragedy," he said. "And faith in God, loyalty to God, involves confronting and challenging the many sources of unnecessary human misery and suffering, most of which are unjust and violent, humanly created social systems." That was central to Jesus. He was executed by the powers who ruled his world because he had become a radical critic of the way things were. He says, Christians are called to participate in his passion for a different kind of world, to confront, to challenge, and to participate. That is very different than just attending church weekly, singing hymns and saying prayers. This requires action. So again, I go to Middle Church, New York City. Here's just a real quick clip from their Instagram page. And it was probably a week or two of posts. And as you can see, almost every post on here is a call to action or a call to the table. And if you look at the rest of their page, they're doing the work, they're acting. There's a reason why this church is thriving. And it also is in a city with a lot of people, so that helps. It's not about the amount of people that show up. It's about the amount of people you are serving. Also, Middle Church created a series of popular anti-racism workshops and then dedicated $100,000 of that income to Black Lives Matter education toward reparations. The United Church of Christ at the national setting has paid off over $12 million in medical debt to low-income families in cooperation with other nonprofits, and is speaking out against systemic injustice in the healthcare system that disproportionately affects Black and Indigenous peoples. A United Methodist Church in Ohio is returning 3 acres of land to the Wyandottie Nation. The Mission Church in the middle of a cemetery was built 2 centuries ago with just over $1,000 and First Nation people's labor. Deeding the 3 acres of land back to the Wyandottie Nation is a small but powerful acknowledgement of the suffering its members endured when the government made them leave their land and the part the church played in the stealing of those lands. It also acknowledges them as our siblings who have worth, a radical concept. A number of other churches are participating in the growing land back movement, which calls on both Canada and the United States to return land to the First Nations and Native American people who first lived there. And these are just a few examples of what happens when we move past the guilt and the shame and the fragility that keeps us in avoidance and denial and into radical acceptance of our debts, our sins, and the error of our ways. Next, we must maintain hope. At the heart of Christianity and in the path of Jesus is wild hope and living and loving with abandon. As John Shelby Spong said, live fully and love wastefully. He said, if God is the source of love, as I believe God is, then the only way you can worship God is by loving, not by being right, but by loving wastefully. The image in my mind is an old sink in the basement that you plug up the drains and then you turn on all the taps and the water overflows and the boundaries of the sink and goes over all over the floor and fills up every crack and cranny and never stops to ask whether that crack deserves this living water. You love because love is what you have to do, not because somebody deserves the love. You love wastefully. Radical love, patience, and trust require hope, and we must maintain that burning light within if we're going to be a real part of transforming our communities and our world. Hope tells us that there will always be more living water within us to pour out of us. We must keep pushing. It's going to take hard, dedicated, and exhausting work to continue to evolve Christian theology and to remove all the echoes of racism from our liturgy and our rituals. Take rest, take turns, but never stop pushing. John Shelby Spong certainly never stopped. Marcus Borg did not either. Progressive leaders and communities need to continue or start any day now, modeling the transformation of systems that pervade our current global experience through radical love. Push every day to center, listen, and learn from Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who will lead the way. United States Vice President Kamala Harris has been known to say, quote, "I eat no for breakfast." I love that word. She kept on pushing, and she isn't going to let up now, and neither can we. Progressive Christians, the time has come to fully engage in the world and be active in our pursuits of radical compassion and service. Gather your church and ask, how can we radically model the love Jesus offered to the world? It's time for Christianity to work more to bring the kingdom of God to earth than trying to get to the kingdom of heaven. We must not forget. Poet, leader, and author Sonia Ray Taylor says, "White supremacist delusion demands amnesia." White supremacist delusion demands amnesia in order to survive. We can't forget where the church has done harm and has been oppressive and unjust, or we will just repeat the cycle of fear and othering, complacency and apathy, and this will just die away because that is not relevant in today's world. We must create new narratives and images. The new, diverse, just, and life-giving narratives that we create need to represent all of us and center the least of us. They must be a balance of accountability and radical empathy and forgiveness. So tell me, which of these two images looks like what you see in your church? What does the stained glass windows look like? Every church I've gone into is a bunch of white guys. Which one is a historically accurate representation of Jesus? I really don't think Jesus was this guy. And it does not feel good, I'm assuming, as a Black, brown, queer, otherly abled person to see only this. Is the imagery and liturgy of your church representative of marginalized groups of people? Would a Black person see themselves? Would a woman, a queer person, an other abled person? A couple more stories about the church that I grew up in and what is possible for churches still. These are borrowed from an article by Deepa Barath in the Orange County Register. Lorraine Fox of Mission Viejo, raised as a Christian fundamentalist, was ostracized from her church because she was gay. "They kicked me out of Bible school," she said. "For the next 25 years, I stayed away from church. I just couldn't sit with people who sang about love, but didn't practice it." In 1991, she heard about the church in Irvine that had opened its doors to the LGBTQ community. "The minute I walked in, I cried," she said. "And I cried the entire service. I felt like I had come home." Fox says she never wanted to go to a gay church. It's like going to a gay bar, she said. It's like, I have to hide myself for being gay. But here was a place where I could practice my faith and be myself. That was exactly how Christine Roy, a transgender woman, says she felt too. Roy had stopped going to church when she got serious about her identity because she believed the two were mutually exclusive. She couldn't be her self and be a Christian. The Irvine Church was the first one she went to as Christine. She says, it's a big deal to be able to go to church as yourself, your true self. That's how you get a deeper connection to your faith. Roy also took part in the church's ministry to LGBTQ detainees placed on immigration hold in Santa Ana. It meant a lot, she says, not just to be helped, but be able to reach out and support someone like me. I felt like I was no longer an outsider. I'm someone. I'm a part of community. So where to start? Fellow followers of Jesus. What breaks your heart? Look with honesty at the world and notice what breaks your heart. And then start with just one thing that lends healing to that brokenness. We cannot fix it all. No individual can fix the world, but we can make a difference. And certainly a community of people can make a big difference. What breaks your heart can break open your community. So there is room for new growths in the cracks and a deeper cause. Pick one thing and do it well. The best way to worship God is to care for God's people. And when you don't know what to do, find BIPOC leaders who are already building those just systems that Jesus longed for. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. They have been calling us to pay attention for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Listen, learn, show up. You know when else I have felt whole? Marching in Black Lives Matter protests alongside thousands of other humans, chanting and crying and singing songs of justice, demanding an end to the hate and fear of racism. So let us take our 40 days in the desert to grieve and wrestle with our grief and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But then, for the love of God, for the love of what is good and worthy, let us come out of the desert and do something and be a Christian. I stand with you as we step into our collective healing. I march with you as we commit to walking the walk. It is what Jesus asked of us all along. Jack Spong taught me that Jesus calls us to the mission to transform the world so that every living being has the opportunity to live fully, love wastefully, and be all that they can be. In this experience of God, there are no outcasts, no others. In this experience of God, we are fully accepted just as we are. That must and can only begin within each of us. First, we must accept ourselves fully as we are, without one plea. And then we must put ourselves on task of growing to be all that we can be and loving the world wastefully. The Christ in me is an infinite well of love that I can pour wastefully over myself, over you, over all of life. God within me asks for nothing less than a life fully lived. May we rest from this eternal struggling of becoming and see within ourselves a perfect being. May the infinite well of love within us overflow over all of humanity. May we see each living being with the eyes of Christ where no boundaries exist. May our love bring oneness out of diversity, wholeness out of brokenness, and eternity out of time. May we join together in this ministry, the ministry of being Christian. Can progressive Christianity be a hope for a future? I believe it already is. It already is a hope in this world. It's a place for healing. It's a place for action. It's a place for learning and radical acceptance. There are many, many examples of churches. I only talked about a couple, but there are a ton of churches, small, medium, large, that are doing real work, and people find out about them because of the work they're doing in the community. So I'm just going to end with this. Here's an example of a church that's thriving, multi-generational, diverse. And this is the now. So just imagine where we can go from here. Thank you.
When the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours one day. When the war is won, we will be sure. We will be sure. Somebody say glory. When the glory comes, it will be ours. It will be ours one day. When the war is won, we will be sure. We will be sure. Let me hear you say glory. Oh, glory. Fight on to the finish, and when it's all done, we will cry glory, yeah, glory, glory, and we cry glory, yeah, glory,
Thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Deshna. That was absolutely wonderful. I wish I could sing like that. I really do. We're now going to take a short break, just a 5-minute break.
I'm Marianne Borg, wife of Marcus Borg. Marcus, as many of you know, was beloved. He still is. An historian, a theologian, an author and teacher of clarity, wisdom, power, and light, a lover of Jesus, and an evangelist for the heart of Christianity. His death, January 21st, 2015, has left us with an immeasurable loss. Or shall I say, an urgent invitation to take seriously our own call to be ambassadors and embodiments of the heart of Christianity.
When language about God is understood literally or semi-literally, the result is what I and a number of other contemporary writers call supernatural theism. By that we mean, specifically, thinking of God as a person-like being out there, separate from the universe, and who relates to the world through intervention. This is the God whose existence Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, they're the 3 best-selling atheist authors at the moment, deny. And they're absolutely right in my judgment. I don't think that God exists either. But that's the God that results from literalizing or semi-literalizing our language about God, as if to say that God has person-like qualities is to say that God is a person, admittedly a super powerful, supernatural person. Being Christian is not primarily about believing a set of statements, teachings, beliefs, doctrines to be true. To suppose that it is about beliefs is to imagine that Jesus' purpose was to bring a set of true doctrines or true teachings, as if his message was, believe these and you will be saved. Rather, the Christian life moves beyond convention to intention and transformation. It is about a way, a path of transformation. Indeed, as most of you know, the earliest name of the post-Easter movement was the Way, according to Acts 9:1. And we find this language of the way as a path of transformation in the New Testament as a whole. In the Gospels, Jesus speaks of taking up the cross and following him. And the cross in that metaphor becomes a metaphor for dying to an old way of being and being born into a new way of being. So also in the letters of Paul, Paul speaks of dying and rising with Christ. This is an image of radical personal transformation. And this is also the authentic meaning of John's language of being born again.
Divinity is seen when the human is whole, when the human can become the vessel through which the divine can flow. Jesus called all of us to step beyond our limits. John's Gospel catches that better than anybody else. For John's Gospel has Jesus say, when you see the Son of Man lifted up, and he means on the cross, giving his life away, no longer survival-oriented. When you see the Son of Man on the cross, then you will know I am. Jesus doesn't say, then you'll know that I am he. That's a mistranslation. He's claiming the name of God. When you see me lifted up, when you see my life so free that I can give it away, so whole that I don't have to protect it, when you see me lifted up, powerless, that's when you see the meaning of God.
Welcome back. I'm now going to hand you over to Sue Hobley, who will be introducing our second speaker, Jeremy. Sue, over to you.
So I'd like to very much welcome Jeremy to our webinar tonight. I know that Adrian met Jeremy at a conference in Australia some years ago. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you in person, Jeremy, but I did look you up on the internet, and of course I found out that you are an assistant bishop in Brisbane and you've been there since 2017, and I was of course impressed by your Anglican credentials, that you served as a parish priest, an archdeacon and a dean of a cathedral before you became a bishop. Jeremy describes himself as a progressive Christian who lives on the edge of the church, and I think many of us can identify with that position. He has said that he'd be happy to abandon the Apostles' Creed, and he was ready to bless same-sex marriage, because if you can bless pets, why can't you bless human beings? I also had a quick look at your Anglican Focus news site for the Anglican Church in South Queensland and looked at some of the things that you write week by week. And one of the things that struck me was your article about coming off Twitter and about the need to build community. And Rowan Williams' suggestion of the 3 important qualities needed: honesty, peacefulness and accountability, which make for real wholesome relationships. And I think in the context of our news this week, we need to hear more of that. So welcome, Jeremy. We look forward to hearing what you've got to say to us about the hope for the future, especially in your Australian context.
Thank you so much, Sue. And as you can see, the sun has just come up, so I'm just going to pull the blinds down. So apologies. So thank you very much for that introduction, Sue, and hello from Bundaberg. Not so early in the morning now, thanks, Adrian. I've got a cup of coffee on board, so feeling ready for the day. So I'm in Bundaberg, which is about 5 hours drive north of Brisbane in Queensland, Australia. And it's wonderful to be here. The sun's up, and for those of you in other parts of the world, I can say with all honesty, there are kangaroos outside my window as I speak. So, so really, really Australian. As I begin my remarks, I'd like to acknowledge the Gurung people, the traditional custodians of the land around Bundaberg. I pay my respects to the elders of the Gurung people. They're the ones who hold the memories and the stories and the traditions and the culture of this land. And I acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty in this place was never ceded, and that the story of this place, especially here around Bundaberg, is a story of genocide and of dispossession. It's also a story around here of slavery. I'm surrounded by cane fields. The sugar industry is still an important part of the country around here. And there was a long history 100 years ago of bringing labourers from Pacific Island nations to work the cane fields. And there's a bell on a church not far from here with a plaque that says, "This was the bell that was used to summon the workers from the cane fields." And so that story of both the genocide and dispossession of First Nations people, but also the appalling treatment of others over the last 150 years is still quite close to the surface. And as we do the work of faith, as Deshna said, it's impossible to do that work without engaging deeply with the pain and the sorrow of not just ancient history, but fairly recent history as well. So I bring all those things and this context this morning. I was really taken by the description of this event that promised two leading and younger voices for progressive Christianity. Well, it was terrific to hear Deshna, so that was great. One of the great gifts of the church and parts of the progressive movement at this time in our history is that I can still be considered young. So thank you for that. It's a joy. I too am deeply indebted to the work of Marcus and Jack, whose writings I encountered when I was a young theological student, wondering just what it was I was getting into. And so while I like to think of myself sitting somewhere on the edge of the church, I have this strange life where I've increasingly had roles in the church that make it look like I'm going closer and closer to the centre. And so it's a very strange place to be, sort of balancing all those things. And Richard Raw writes about being on the edge of the inside, that really productive and exciting, but also terrifying and difficult place to be. And so I know all of those things in my life and work. So I'm going to, since Deshna managed the technology so seamlessly, I'm going to see if I can do the same thing. So I wanted to begin my thoughts this morning or this evening or this afternoon, wherever you happen to be, by sketching out some of the Australian context, because my hunch is that there's plenty of things that we share across the United States and Britain and Europe and Australia. There's some things that might look a bit different. So here's a bit of a snapshot of Australia's religious identity, and there's a few things to notice. In common with what's happening around the world, for the first time since the census information has been collated, no religion, and people saying they're spiritual but not religious, has overtaken Christianity as the largest percentage of the population. When these figures were collected a few years ago, that sat at about 56%. I think 46%. I think the last census in the last couple of years pushes it well over 50%. And when you look more closely at those who say that they're Christian, there are questions to ask about what that might actually mean. With only 7% of those people saying that they are active participants in their faith. You can see that exponential growth of people saying they have no religion on the graph down in the bottom right. In Australia, when people are asked what it is that defines their personal identity, religious beliefs come a long, long way down at the bottom of the list. And we're likely to be defined by our political beliefs, though perhaps not as starkly as it seems happens in the United States. But people see themselves defined by their nationality, their gender, their language, their job. Religious beliefs comes a long way down the list. Interestingly, in the Australian population, over 70% of people say that religion is not important in my life. A bit over 50% say God is not important in my life. Interesting that over 65% of Anglicans say the same thing. Religion is not important in my life. Around 45% of Australians say that they never talk about spirituality or religion. It's just not something that is on people's radar. Of the 9% who say that they do regularly talk about religion or spirituality, that's a figure that lines up with those people who we saw previously are actively committed to their particular faith. For people who don't identify as a Christian, 80% of those people say they wouldn't even consider exploring Christianity. 80% of people who are not Christian say they wouldn't even consider it. Now, such is the baggage that Christianity brings to the Australian context. Even though most people would say that the Christians they know are caring and loving and kind and honest. And those big issues that prevent people from an openness to Christianity are things like teachings and perceived attitudes to homosexuality, teachings and ideas about hell and condemnation, abuse in the church, hypocrisy, and a perception that you have to believe in the supernatural, miracle stories. That idea that Christianity is about believing 11 impossible things before breakfast. So all of this is the context to trying to live out a faith in Australia. And then in the last 10 years or so, there have been two other key things that have fed into perceptions that people have about what Christianity might be about in this country. In 2013, a Royal Commission was established into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And over 4 years, the stories of over 16,000 people were told and retold night after night on the news. And by the time the Royal Commission had done its work at the end of 2017, there were 17 volumes of findings. And those 17 volumes told the stories of nearly 17,000 people who told their stories of abuse. And nearly 60% of those survivors said that the abuse they suffered took place in an institution managed by a religious organisation. Over 30% said they were abused by a person in religious ministry. And there were 189 recommendations for institutions, mainly for the churches, on how the churches might do better in the future in terms of protecting children and young people. During the darkest days of the Royal Commission, I know clergy who were spat on in the street. I know of churches that were vandalised. I remember having things yelled at me from passing cars. And I get a sense as stories come out of Canada over the last weeks and months that similar things are happening in that place. It's very hard to identify as a Christian when this is the narrative that's unfolding night after night on the news. And of course, it doesn't matter which particular part of the church you belong to or which particular part of the church is in the news. People usually don't distinguish. It's those Christians, and we all wear the shame and the focus of people's anger and sadness and dismay. And it seems that for the church here and in many places around the world, any sort of public trust, any sort of moral authority that we may once have had is gone. If not forever, certainly for decades to come, as we do that hard work of rebuilding some credibility, rebuilding some trust, rebuilding a sense of our place in the world. In 2017, just as the Royal Commission was preparing to present its report to the Australian Parliament, Australia was preparing to vote in a plebiscite on marriage equality. It was presented to us by the government as a non-binding indicative vote. And while it had been clear for a long time that a majority of Australians supported marriage equality and that a majority of Christians supported marriage equality, it didn't stop the conservative voices in the Christian churches shouting their opposition. And even in the case of the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, giving $1 million to support the No campaign. Even in 2013 in Australia, there was more support for marriage equality within the churches than there was opposition. 45% versus 30% of Catholics, 47% versus 30% of Anglicans, 43% versus 34% of Uniting Church and Methodists. And yet the conservative voices in the church doubled down.
The Anglican Archbishop of Sydney is under fire this morning after telling same-sex marriage supporters to leave the church rather than betray God's word. Archbishop Glenn Davies has warned the church has entered, quote, treacherous waters, slamming branches that had moved to bless same-sex unions. But he concedes that his view is not a popular one in Australia and doesn't line up with the law.
And so, of course, people continue to opt out at greater and greater rates. People who embrace tolerance and diversity and equality and inclusion and find none of those things in the church, especially the church that is loudest in some of these debates. Martin Percy recently wrote, while evangelicalism remains committed to evangelism, this emerging generation is probably more committed to tolerance, diversity, equality, and inclusion. Young people are different. They value sensitivity, mutual respect of differences, and otherness. They're against discrimination on grounds of gender, sexuality, disability, and ethnicity. They're likely to be advocates of equality for minorities. He says this means that targeting, grooming, and coercing their peers, which used to be called evangelism in universities, has become a mode of evangelicalism that many millennials and Gen Zers now want to keep a safe distance from. And yet, even the most liberal denominations in Australia continue with inward-looking church growth campaigns and programs designed to prop up the institution rather than reorienting themselves outwards. They insist on clinging to doctrine and dogma conceived in an age long ago, rather than rediscovering the gifts at the heart of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. They cling to ideas about permanence and certainty, rather than being open to the freedom offered by a precarious faith. I'm reminded of John Robinson, who said that all the church was ever meant to be was the constructor's hut on God's building site, which is the world. Christians today assume all too easily that God's primary concern lies with the church. But God is building a kingdom in the world, a prophetic polity rooted in superabundant justice, liberation, and compassion. Our churches are merely transitory temples to achieve these ends. Churches are not God's final goal. Churches are not God's final goal. And of course, that's where I locate my sense of hope, which is a strange thing for a bishop in the church to say, perhaps. But it seems to me that despite all of the things that seem to count against Christianity having any future, people still perceive that there is something positive at the heart of our story. Australians still value the work of Christians in caring for people who are homeless or vulnerable, offering financial support or food relief, providing disaster relief. Those very practical outworkings of the faith that are freed from doctrine and dogma, but are about rolling up your sleeves and engaging with the world. People still see in the person of Jesus someone who embodies love, hope, care, and truth, even if they don't see any of those things in the church. So it seems to me that the way that we might keep the story alive, the place where we might locate hope, is if the story is embedded in deep and authentic practices that demonstrate the love, the hope, the care, the truth that was embodied in the person of Jesus. The sorts of things, as Marcus said in that clip earlier on, that saw early Christians known as people of the way, which helped the stories of the faith spread. In a couple of pandemics back in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it was Christians by and large at risk to their own lives who cared for the sick and the poor. They took seriously the words of Jesus to love one another. The plague of, in the 2nd century, the plague of Galen was a pandemic now believed to be smallpox, which was introduced to the Roman Empire by soldiers coming back from Syria. 5 million people died as it ran its course. In the following century, the plague of Cyprian spread from Africa throughout the known world. Half of the people who encountered that disease died. And during each pandemic, as government officials and the wealthy fled the cities for the countryside to escape contact with those who were infected, the Christian community remained behind, transforming themselves into a community of practice, a community of love, a community of caretakers. The Bishop of Corinth in 260 in the Common Era praised the efforts of these Christian communities and said, most of our brother Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves and thinking only of one another. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need and ministering to them in Christ. And with them departed this life serenely happy, for they were infected by others with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbours and cheerfully accepting their pains. It was this care and love of neighbour, even at great risk to themselves, that showcased the integrity of their message of love for the world. It was the actions of these small early communities that had such great impact. It was this sort of selfless love that caused that explosion of Christian congregations alongside Judeo-Christian communities. Faith mattered because it was located in practice. It was located in engagement with the world. It was located in authentic relationship with others and not bound tightly by notions of intellectual assent to creeds and doctrines that sought uniformity and a clear delineation between who's in and who's out. Faith mattered because it was grounded not in belief, but as Marcus says, in intention and transformation. And of course, in Australia, like in other places, the progressive Christian movement is characterised by engagement in the world. It takes seriously the understanding that that is where our work is to be done. It adopts a posture of humility in seeking to listen to where and how we might engage. Living out of what one writer calls a blind obsession with love. It asks the question over and over and over, what should we do? And in the light of the stories at the heart of our tradition and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, how should we do it? And as Diana Butler-Bass reminds us in her book, Christianity After Religion, long after doctrine and dogma have gone, it's the practices that will remain. Practices that are grounded in our tradition, but grounded in our experience of the world. And so just as those early Christian communities were known for how they responded to the needs around them, it seems to me that hope for the future in the progressive Christian movement will be found in the way that we respond to the needs of the world around us, in practice. Our future lies in doing the careful, honest and humble work of listening for hints of what we might be called to be and do in this new age, and having the courage to reimagine the practices of the tradition, the rituals, the ceremonies, and everything else to assist us in making meaning out of it all. We'll find hope as we continue to gather together. Because as a friend said recently, we can't make meaning on our own. But our gatherings will be shaped by our experience of engaging with the sorrows and the joys, the tragedies and the triumphs of the communities in which we're located. How could we be church in this place, in Bundaberg, without reference to those stories that sit just below the surface? And of course, as progressive Christians, we might continue to do the work of equipping people with a spiritual literacy so that they can keep finding words to articulate something about that thing that's so important to human lives. Transcendence. Losing ourselves in something that's bigger than ourselves. An antidote to the arrogant conviction that I am the centre of the universe and I hold the truth, and if only you would see things the way I see things, the world would be a better place. experiencing ourselves as part of something more, something bigger. One person describes it thus: when our soul is fed, we remember in our bones that we are bound up in something beyond ourselves, something ineffably present. We feel fully big and fully small. Our taproot sunk into a place that is old and deep. When we map pathways for people to encounter and move closer to this endlessly renewable resource at the heart of all things, we unleash creativity and courage. Being part of something bigger than ourselves that stretches back into the past. But with creativity and courage, we're able to step into a new future. And of course, we do all of this grounded in that blind obsession with love that was at the heart of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, intentionally seeking authenticity and depth. I quite like Sam Wells' language of a future that's bigger than the past, as a way of imagining what sort of future there is for progressive Christianity. It's a future that's bigger than the past, but perhaps more humble, more courageous, more open, more grounded, more authentic. Last night I was at a school awards night, and I heard young person after young person after young person speak passionately and eloquently about inclusive community, about the environment, about justice. Occasionally they even mentioned faith. But through it all, I had a deep sense that they knew what it meant to live fully and love wastefully, to bring comfort and challenge. I had a deep and hopeful sense that our future is in good hands. I remain incredibly hopeful. And we shouldn't let our own limited imaginations stop us from being part of whatever future is being created by those who share our values of love and peace and reconciliation and hope. And so, progressive Christianity, a hope for the future? Absolutely. Yeah, we live as people of hope. It's exciting and terrifying, but it's terrific to be on the journey. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. We've got time just to ask a couple of questions of you both. Perhaps Deshna, let Jeremy catch his breath and you can field the first question, and then Jeremy might like to answer as well. The first one comes from Andy, who congratulates you, Deshna, for producing the teaching guide, A Joyful Path. Which he says teaches children a way of living and loving which is not dependent on the narrative of the one true God intervened in history to send his son to die for our salvation. Andy thinks, if this is good for children, why is it not good for adults too? Jeremy, you mentioned just now the issue of believing the unbelievable. So Andy asks, isn't it time that the progressive church consigned this traditional narrative to the status of an ancient myth, part of our history, but no longer the foundation of our spiritual lives? Over to you, Deshna.
That's a great question, and thank you for the support. I think it gets really tricky when we start to define where progressive Christianity is in a timeline, where we should be, because progressive Christianity is a living, breathing being, and people are not just all starting at one point and then going along a line. Progressive Christianity is more like a spiral, and people jump on that spiral at all these different places in time. Some are coming straight out of white evangelicalism and are just starting to say, is it possible that Jesus was a human being? Is it possible that hell doesn't exist? Is it possible that God is not a male gendered being with power over our lives? So whereas there's other people who have been deconstructing and studying scholarly work for 25, 30, 40 years and are saying, isn't it time that we do this? In my work with the organization progressivechristianity.org, I came across that a lot because mostly I worked with older white men who had been along this journey for many years, who had studied, who had read these books, who had read all the books. And they would say to me, you know, when I was trying to be inclusive of newer progressive Christian people who maybe not even identified as progressive Christian yet, but had a voice and had something to share. And they would say, well, we can't include them because they're not real progressive Christians because they don't believe this thing, or because they still believe this. And I just time and time again would need to say, imagine boats full of people coming. And we are saying, oh, only these guys over here, because they're already ready. They're already at a certain place. It's you know, so another story, I recently at a church and there's all these different ages of people. And there was a man there who had been there for a very long time, steward of the church, 80-year-old man, brilliant guy, psychiatrist. And he says, well, I like the 8 points a lot that you guys put together. He said, but it's really, really lacking. It doesn't say the word God. It doesn't talk about the word of God. It doesn't say things that are very important to our church. And I thought, well, very important to you. And that's the beauty of the 8 points or things like that, where it gives you a foundation to build upon within your own authentic belief and your own, you know, the theology of your church and your community that you guys can talk about and discuss and be open to. So I don't think it's time for anything in particular other than what I said earlier, is to say, it's okay for you to question your beliefs. That's the bottom line for me. That's a progressive Christian. Everything else is on the table and we should welcome it. Otherwise, we're not being progressive. We cannot create a dogmatic theology and call ourselves progressive. We just can't. In regards to the curriculum, yes, new teachings and new narratives and new stories need to be created 100%. And they need to be centered because we've heard all those other stories. We've heard about the white male God up in the sky forever. So yeah, let's talk about a Black woman God. Let's talk about a transgender God. Let's talk about there not being a God. Let's talk about all those things and let's celebrate all those diverse expressions of the great mystery that none of us know what it is. So let's stop pretending like we know and just start radically including people. And the bottom line for me is, are you willing and are you able to question?
Thank you very much. Jeremy, from your position on the wherever you are, edge of the inside, outside of the inside, wherever you might be, what's your perspective on this?
I think I'd add to what Deshna said. It highlights really the importance of adult Christian education. That was something that Marcus was absolutely passionate about. And, you know, we invest time and energy into children's stuff and young people's stuff. But to have the sorts of conversations that Deshna's talking about, people need to be equipped to ask those questions and to be able to articulate some of those things. And that only comes when we give people the opportunities, you know, like this and like, you know, some of those other curricula that are around, to actually do that work. You know, week after week, I'm in congregation after congregation and meet people whose last bit of Christian education happened when they were in Sunday school. and I will say things that have been pretty mainstream, not even progressive, but mainstream for 50, 60 years, and it's brand new to people. You know, people don't have the tools to begin that work that Deshna is talking about. So I think, you know, that's incredibly important, opportunities for conversation and education.
Fantastic, thank you. As we're on the subject of books, and as Deshna said, you know, some of us like to read all the books. Jim mentions a book called Just Faith by Guthrie Greaves Fitzsimmons, who writes that judging a society based on how the most vulnerable are treated isn't just the foundation of the progressive Christian social witness, but the entire idea of what we call the progressive movement. This is in the United States. So Jim asks then, is it indeed the entire idea of the progressive movement, whether that's in the USA or Australia? Would you like to start us with that one, Jeremy?
I don't think it's the entire idea, but it's an important place to begin for many people, because I think it is about shifting that sense of our own privilege, and you know, so beginning a conversation in Bundaberg about slavery and about dispossession and genocide takes us to a very different place if all I bring is the privilege that I enjoy as a middle-class white male. And so it really does reframe the conversation. But we layer into that all sorts of other things as well. You know, we have stories from our tradition that shine light on that in different ways. So it's not a bad place to begin some of the conversations, but I don't think it's the entirety of the conversation.
Yeah, I would just add to that again, progressive Christianity is it's like trying to say what an American is. We have 50 states. We are very diverse. We have people from all over the world identifying as American. We have a huge range of perspectives and beliefs and cultures and ideas. And I think progressive Christianity is reflective of that. So yes, I think it's time today, especially, for us to examine how are we as people, as human beings, as followers of Jesus, how are we treating the least of us? And there's my Zoom cat. And because that's great if our comfortable, privileged members that have been there for many years are happy to come to church and feel comfortable still. But if the least of us are not feeling that way, if the least of us are not feeling served, are not feeling included, seen, represented in leadership, etc., then I would say we're not fulfilling the mission to walk the path of Jesus. And if we look at Jesus, he was essentially the least of us. So if we are seeing ourselves as those that, it's never talked about in the Bible how many things Jesus had, how much money he had, how popular he was, how comfortable he was. So I think it's an important part of progressive Christianity, indeed, and Christianity in general. So,
Deshna, sorry, I was reminded when you're talking about that sort of amorphous sense of what progressive Christianity is or isn't. Val Webb's terrific book, Like Catching Water in a Net, which is about how we talk about God, but in a similar way. Just when you think you've got hold of it, it slips away and it's more or different or bigger.
Yeah, indeed.
I can see we've got more questions coming in, but sadly we're out of time. Jeremy, we've all been enjoying that beautiful rainbow that's been across your face for most of your talk. So thank you for that. It's a sign of something, I think. I'm going to hand back now to my colleague, Adrian.
But it's time very much to end our evening with very, very sincere thanks. I'm going to ask Julie, first of all, who's going to give these vote of thanks.
Thank you, Adrian. I've got such a scribbled set of notes here that if I can work my way through them and make some sense of what I want to say, I shall be pleased. Our coming together this evening or afternoon or morning has given us such a wonderful opportunity, not only to honour the memory of those two heroes, giants of progressive Christianity in the past, whose legacies we treasure and who have been constantly referenced throughout the whole evening, but also to listen to two younger voices leading in progressive Christianity across the globe, really, in different dimensions, different places and continents. So Deshna and Jeremy, we are so grateful to you both for your inspirational contributions tonight, the deep insights that you've given us into the contexts in which you minister, with all their joys and challenges and sadnesses. Deshna's passionate cri de coeur and Jeremy's very thoughtful, realistic picture of the way that you live your faith and share it. It seems it's up to us to rally to action, to live as people of hope, and to encourage others to come with us. You've assured us, both of you, that there is hope in the future. And let's hope that it's a future that's bigger than the past. So thank you both very much indeed.
Well, I've got the privilege yet again, this time, of just wrapping our evening up. I was reminded, and Jeremy and Deshna may not know this, of course, but David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, once said, "I was the future once." And I think that in a way, some of us can echo those. We were the future once. But I think what Deshna has reminded us very much is that we have to give honour to Marcus and Jack and Richard Holloway and all those other people. But that torch of open, liberal, radical, Christian, progressive faith has got to be carried throughout our different countries and cultures. And that's why tonight, for me, and I'm sure for everybody who's been watching and listening, has been so important to hear the positive affirmation of all that you perceive to be so good about your own country, Deshna, in spite of all the negative things that we sometimes do here. Jeremy painting that very realistic picture of the pluses and minuses along the journey of faith, and ourselves in this country at the moment experiencing the sadness of the murder of a member of our parliament and all the culture wars that seem to be behind that, then at times we seem to be overwhelmed with negativity. But I think from tonight, I, and I'm sure all of us, will be encouraged by what you have said and who you are. And I just want to finally thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, for getting up so early, but thank you, as Simon has said, for letting the rainbow shine on you. Thank you, Deshna, for telling us of your personal journey. That was very, very encouraging. And we love to see the pussycat as well. And thank you, everybody. And have a good evening, a good morning, or wherever you are. And from here in the UK, good night.